Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Tate Britain. My name's Madeleine Keep, and I'm Curator of Public Programmes. Everyone here okay? Yeah? Okay. So, I'm going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. There are no fire alarms planned for this evening. So if you do hear an alarm sound, then myself and my colleagues will help you leave through the exit and entrance at the back. As you can see, we're filming tonight. And this film will be on Tate's YouTube channels, so you can find that after the talk or if you want to refer back. We will also have some time for questions later. So for everyone to hear your question, for Anne and for Rachel to hear it, if you could wait for the handheld mic. Don't worry about the sound, it will come up when you start talking. So, to tonight. On behalf of Tate, I'd like to thank Rachel Whiteread for kindly agreeing to talk to us this evening. It's a great privilege to hear directly from artists about their work. So many of you will have seen, I'm sure, the exhibition upstairs, and if you haven't had the chance yet, it's on until the 4th of February. The show brings together well-known works such as Untitled 100 Spaces, 1995, and Untitled Staircase, 2001, alongside new pieces that have never been previously exhibited. And on the lawn outside, I'm sure you will have seen the new concrete sculpture, Chicken Shed, of this year. Among her most renowned works are House, a large concrete cast of the inside of an entire Victorian house, the Holocaust Memorial sculpture in Judenplatz, Vienna, and her resin sculpture monument for the empty plinth in London's Trafalgar Square. And Whiteread lives and works in London, and her work is represented in many private and public collections. Tonight, Rachel Whiteread will be talking with Anne Gallagher. Anne leads curators responsible for building and researching Tate's collection of British art. She's Director of Collections. She herself specialises in modern and contemporary British art, as well as Latin American art from 1950. And Anne curated the Whiteread exhibition with Lindsay Young and Hattie Spires. Previous exhibitions Anne has curated for Tate are the Iliotiseca, The Body of Colour at Tate Modern in 2007, Susan Hiller at Tate Britain in 2011, and the Damien Hirst exhibition at Tate Modern in 2012. Anne contributed a text to the catalogue for Rachel's drawing exhibition, Shedding Life, at Tate Liverpool in 2006. Before joining Tate, Anne also worked with Rachel on her retrospective exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio and Sao Paulo in 2004, and her 1997 Venice Biennale exhibition at the British Pavilion. So now I'd like to hand over to Anne, who's going to begin the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeleine. Can everybody hear me? Great. Thank you, Rachel, for coming back to Tate Britain after spending so many weeks with us installing your wonderful exhibition. We're now into the third month of the exhibition, and well over 50,000 people have already seen the show. I'm sure many of the people here this evening have, but to remind you, we've got a lot of photographs, and also to remind ourselves what we want to talk about. The advantage of the show having been on for these months is that we've had a lot of feedback about the sort of questions that people want to know from Rachel. So I'm going to try and vocalise some of those, and then there'll be time at the end for everyone to ask questions that we may not have covered. So Rachel, can I just start with a question that everyone asks after seeing in the exhibition the vitrine of objects from your studio? The picture here for everybody, a vitrine with objects that we borrowed from Rachel's studio, which looks a bit like this, and which is surrounded by objects that relate to Rachel's work, inspirations, notebooks, objects she's collected, objects from her family. Rachel, how does this all feed into your work as an artist, and how do you, as a studio artist, how does this dictate the way you work?
I use objects a bit like a sketchbook. One would use a sketchbook. And, I mean, maybe just talking about things that are here, for example...
To the right.
No, it's right.
Okay.
I've got it. I'm doing it behind you.
I'm so used to telling Rachel what to do.
So here is a group of cast spoons, which are things that I made, and actually in the vitrine there are a number of them sort of dotted around. And these are things, when I was at college and I was in my second year at Brighton studying painting, I did this little sort of foundry course. And I did this very simple thing of pushing a spoon into some sand, and then I poured in some molten metal. And what came out of this was a spoon without its spoonness. It had lost the sort of the curve inside the spoon. And this, to me, was a sort of hallelujah moment. And I realised that I could sort of change things by just doing a very simple act. And when just as I've cast other things in the studio, and I've been using the foundries and stuff, I just gave them a group of spoons and just said, can you kind of do these as you're going along? And they're things that I give them away as presents to people. They're lovely things to hold in your hands, a little teaspoon, but without the sort of divot inside it. And all the other objects. So if I just go through here, this is the cast of the inside of a galosha, for example. That is a brain. There's pieces of crystal, there are bronzes, there's bits of wood that I found in the Thames. There are just lots and lots of things that I've found. There's a plaster cast of a lady lying down, which was from an Egyptian market, which I bought this thing in sugar, then cast it in plaster. So there are things that go back many, many years. This piece at the end here is the very first thing I made when I left college, where I did a bronze casting course in East London, and for £1 you could go for an entire year and cast bronzes, and it was just the most extraordinary place. And, so a lot of these things have been kicking around for 30 years or more in the studio. And along with my sketchbooks, so there are all these sketchbooks which are all the identical size. Unfortunately, the company now doesn't exist, and I can't buy them anymore, and it's a bit of a trauma that I've got, probably 60 of these sketchbooks. I think what I'm trying to say is that this vitrine is like the inside of my head. It's like the things that I see, the things that I like, the things that I pick up, and the things that can be juxtaposed against one another to bring together sort of ideas and a language.
That's fantastic, Rachel. The other thing that people noticed and spent a lot of time watching in this same area of the exhibition, this corridor space as you enter the exhibition, which recorded also all your public projects, was the film right at the end of you creating House. And I think, how you create work, how you work with assistants you've worked with, when do you like to be on your own in the studio, how you actually physically made the very early works, and subsequently how you do them differently now. That's also something people are really interested in.
I mean, with House came really directly after making Ghost, which was a plaster cast of a room, which was the first sort of installation stroke kind of large piece of work that I made. I'd been making studio-based works, and this piece, it cost me about £3,000 or £4,000. I had no money at all. I was on the Enterprise Allowance Scheme. Got tiny grants from a couple of people, and it was really sort of hand-to-mouth existence making it. But as I was making it, I was thinking, and I was in this house, what it would be like to cast the room next door, and the room beyond that, and the room beyond that, and the stairs, and and it was just this thing that I was kind of fascinated with. And after it had been shown, and it got, for a relatively young, unknown artist, it got a lot of publicity. People were very intrigued by it, and there was a group who were called Art Angel, and they had just been taken over by two sort of recent graduates and curators and art producers, so Michael Morris and James Lingwood. And James Lingwood came to my studio and asked me if there was anything I wanted to do, and within a second I didn't hesitate and just said, I want to cast a whole house. And he said, brilliant, let's do it. And it sort of came from that, and we then had to work out how to make it, how much it was going to cost, what assistance we needed and the whole production that went around it. But essentially the first thing we had to do was find the house that we were going to cast. So it was a big production, a bit like a sort of theatre production or something. And but essentially I was working in the studio, and the studio was the house, and I grafted inside there for 6 months. And it was one of the most sort of hellish sort of experiences, but it was wonderful as well. And you know, made me sort of physically kind of ill at the end of it. I was, you know, had a sort of eye infection and, you know, just feeling completely spent. But, you know, we took down the outside of the house, not really knowing what it was going to be because, you know, it'd all been made inside out. And as we peeled away the skin, house appeared, and it was a sort of marvellous moment. And then the rest is sort of history. But during that period, that was the time when I worked out how I could work with assistants and how I like to work with people and how I also like to retreat from that and essentially be a very private artist and work by myself in the studio, which is in fact what I do now. I have assistants, I have people that I work with. And
you haven't always worked with assistants, but there's been times where you've had big studios.
Yes, the studio, we moved to house and studio a couple of years ago, and I had been living and working in this one big building, and I had 2 studios, and one of them was very much a place where I worked with assistants, and then the other one was very much a place where I worked on my own. And it was very good in lots of ways, but it was also very stressful, and I'm actually a much more private artist than that, and I like to just be on my own, really. And then I go to assistants and to another place and say, this is what I've got, can we do this, can we do that? And we make it, and all the mess and the smell and the dirt and the grubbiness stays there, and then I get the beautiful object back into my studio and enjoy it briefly before it goes.
But as we know from this film of House, and also many of the early works, more domestic scale objects that you made earlier, you did cart them around yourself, you manhandled them yourself.
Yeah, I mean, everything that I've made, you know, a lot of the earlier works, which we'll come to in a minute, but a lot of the earlier works were based on how they were sort of made, was sort of based on what I could physically handle, or physically handle maybe with one other person. Marcus, my husband, who's actually here tonight, we've been together for many, many years, and he helped me a lot of the time. And it would be really what the two of us could sort of shift around. And it's amazing what you can do, you know, just knowing how to move something, how you can move quite large things. But yeah, I've always tried to work like that.
I always feel that even your larger scale works have that sense of human scale, because many of them are made up of blocks that can be carried by 1 or 2 persons.
Yeah.
So can we now go on to your very early work? So work that you made while you were still at college, containing actual hot water bottles inside shirts and bedding, which really very quickly you developed into a finished sculpture that was cast. So this and these 3 objects here were in your very first one-person exhibition, 1988, when you were only 25. And that's what fascinates quite a lot of people. Like, how did you develop that sculptural vocabulary so swiftly, from being surrounded by objects, being surrounded by objects in your everyday life, to using those objects and creating something out of them, using a casting process that you've come to make your own, using typologies that you've developed through your career, and a very limited but very distinct set of materials.
Well, I studied painting, and then I studied sculpture. So I did my degree in painting, and then I did my postgraduate in sculpture. When I was making, in the sculpture department at the Slade, I was still finding it difficult to make sculpture. So hence the pieces that you saw of the hot water bottles, one inside a candy-striped, one inside
pillowcase.
A candy-striped pillowcase, and the other inside a Grandad shirt. And they both had water in them. The one inside the Grandad shirt was sort of inverted, and it looked, you know, almost like the genitals that you see coming out of the front. The other one obviously looks like almost like a pregnant belly. So these were probably as close as I came to making sculpture, but they hung on the back of a door when I showed them. You know, when I left college, and, you know, it's a scary time as a young person that's just left postgrad. You've got no money. You know, I had this kind of shitty studio out in the East End with no windows and mice, and then later on I had a slightly better studio, but I was really hand to mouth trying to make work. And, you know, I was using and developing the things that I had, and I was still carting around my postgraduate show, and I probably used one of the hot water bottles that was inside this, you know, to cast the first torso. I don't actually remember, but, you know, they were second-hand hot water bottles. They were things that I was buying for nothing, or finding on the street, or found at home, or got from my mum's house, or, you know, they were things that were very much a part of my everyday life and language. You know, and consequently, when I moved to, when I'd been a student and I was moving around and living in, you know, 2 or 3 different places as a student, you know, and with you always had, if you had an unfurnished flat, you had to get, you know, a bed, and you had to get some sort of wardrobe or something to hang your clothes in, and something to sort of use as a desk, you know. So these were the elements that I was thinking about, and this was, you know, post-war furniture, the stuff that was made very cheaply in the 50s, and almost sort of flat-pack IKEA furniture, but before that was sort of invented. And they were things and places that everybody was familiar with, that smelt of dust and urine. And I also used loot newspaper. That was the thing, which was before eBay or any sort of computer generated sales. And you'd have a newspaper, and you'd go down the list and find for £10 a sort of second-hand mattress, and then you'd drive across London and buy this stinky old mattress and cast it. And that was all part of the pleasure, actually, of doing it. And, you know, and also going to second-hand shops, and there was a Salvation Army place over in Borough that I used all the time. And these were my sketchbooks. These were the places that I went to buy these things and these materials that I sort of had an affiliation with. And this was in the time of Thatcher. This was in the time, you know, very similar to now, where there were lots of people sleeping on the streets. There was Cardboard City at Waterloo. You know, you felt very much that a lot of these things felt to me like lost human beings, and the presence of destitution and sorrow. And somehow I was using these to help evoke what I was doing. You know, where I was living and where the studios were that I was working in, it was all really grimy East End, and the East End that doesn't really exist anymore. You know, you can see it sort of further out, maybe, but, you know, there was a lot of poverty and, yeah. So that's really where all of these things kind of came from. And when, after, you know, a while, I'd been using plaster, and I'd really worked out how I could use the plaster and get it to take on the essence of humanity, I suppose. And I started to then, I got kind of sick of these things being also fragile. And so I wanted to start using rubber, which was a much more expensive material. But by this time I was beginning to sort of sell work a little bit. So I had a bit more money, and, you know, as a sort of, it's sort of extraordinary, and I think artists have always been like this, and they're still like this, that, you know, even if you have nothing, you know, the nothing that you have is spent on making the work that you want to do. So, you know, if you've got some beer money, some roll-ups money, bit of food, and then, you know, a bed to sleep in, and then everything else went on making the work. So I was, you know, at this time, there were a lot of artists around. We were all sort of working, all sort of thinking and making shows and whatever. Yeah.
Is there any link between the materials you used at that time which were all very much associated with the casting process. So plaster and rubber resin usually used to make the moulds to make a more permanent copy of a work, a bronze copy or something. But you used those actual materials as your finished product.
Yeah, no, completely. And I mentioned that I worked in this foundry for £1 a year, and those sorts of materials I was using wax and plaster there, and making bronzes out of it. But then using the plaster and all of the this this black one here. This is a foundry rubber, so it's actually a heat-resistant rubber that you can pour metal on top of. And all of these things, I'd ring up places that were manufacturing rubber and stuff, saying, what I want is something that's like the colour of, really horrible, smelly urine. That's the one I'm looking for. And they'll go, oh, actually, yeah, this, the Shaw 80 has that quality. Yeah, we can, I'll send you a sample. And, so I was, looking at those sorts of things, and people were developing materials for me. And that's always been something that I've been quite interested in.
So beds became one of your typologies, something that you've returned to many times. Hot water bottles, obviously. Beds, mattresses.
Can I move on?
Yep. Baths. You've done a fair number of baths, all expanding from furniture to the fittings you find within a domestic home.
Well, I think a lot of those were all quite sort of funereal in a way. I think that's something that's been said. And, especially the bathtub pieces are like sarcophagi. And, I had been, at one point, I was asked to, Anthony Gormley asked me if I would do a show with him in the British Museum in the Egyptian galleries. And dear Anthony had said, it's great because we'll move all the Egyptian stuff and you can put our stuff in there. And I said, well, surely the point of the Egyptian galleries is that the Egyptian stuff's in there. Maybe we could show it around. Anyway, it didn't work out, but that's sort of what I was, that's what I was sort of looking at and with and for. And, there was a history, it was embedded in history, but it was also contemporaneous. And I was looking at using cast iron bathtubs, which I would then rust and then take the casts off. So you had all this sort of residue, rust residue. And the same with this, which was cast from a fireplace, which was in the room next door to where I made Ghost, which was the single room. This was a sink, which was I called Font. So they had, a lot of them had these other sort of notions and ideas around them. That was called Cell, that was called Font, that was called Ether, and that was called Flap. So they all had other associations with them.
That's probably a good point to move on to scale. So this is a contact sheet of you making or constructing Ghost.
Yeah.
Which the finished work looks like this. Very
if you go back to the slide before.
Very revealing.
Go to the middle one. So this was made really completely by hand. Marcus helped me a little bit with it, but I spend an awful lot of time in this place on my own making this. And it would be, I would cast a block and then take it off, hand cut it, put it back into position, then cast the next block until we had this room that was completely full. The last elements that I did was the door, which was cast in, I think, 6 panels. And it was quite a strange moment. I don't remember if Marcus was with me doing that, or I seem to remember me being on my own and telling the people that I lived in the house next door, I'm doing this on my own today. If I'm not out by kind of 8 o'clock, can you come and find me because I can't get out? It's sort of, I might have just sort of plastered myself into the room. So once I'd made all of this, I felt very strangely like a nun when I made this. not I know what a nun feels like, but I imagined a nun to feel like, because it was really like bricking myself up into this place. And then we just disassembled it all and took it back to my studio, and then we made this crazy sort of Dexian kind of scaffold to hang it all on.
And that's the first time you moved up in scale to a state where you could actually be inside the walls.
Yes. So once I'd made the piece and it was up in the studio, and I went in very early one morning, and the sunrise was coming up, and I opened the door, and it was like this extraordinary moment where I realised that I was the wall, and there was the light switch, and it was back to front, and the door handle, and it was the wrong way round, and it was just this quite an odd moment, and really has been this early work has influenced the next 25 years of what I do.
And the impetus of moving from a room to a house is clear, but it also took you in another direction. That although the house was in fact temporary and was demolished after 80 days, it enabled you to be seen as an artist who could work in the public realm, to work in the open air. Was that entirely unconscious?
Excuse me. It wasn't entirely unconscious. I mean, I knew that I wanted to work on this scale. I knew that I could work on this scale. I knew that I could give the public the run for their money if they needed it. And I knew that I would be able to do it. But what I hadn't reckoned with was the sort of scale of interference that it had, and the scale of anxiety and the sort of political ramifications and the sort of shitstorm that came with it. And
but you say now that you're actually really proud of having made it and of what it said at that moment in time.
Oh, I'm completely proud of it. I think it's, one of the best things I've ever made and probably will ever make. And it really did its job. It was tough, it was political, it was radical, it was meant a lot to people, all sorts of people, for all sorts of different reasons. Some people loved it, some people hated it. There was emotion in the House of Commons about it, and it was really it changed this country's perception of what public art could be. And you have to bear in mind this is way before the times of the YBAs being these kind of big shouty, sweary, drunk group of people that could get away with anything. This was during a kind of quiet time when Tracy and Sarah's shop was going, I think, up the road.
But in 1993.
That was about it. I think Damien was just about on the scene, doing a bit of stuff, but no one was really making a big noise. And the most sort of complex, shouty thing that had happened, I think, was that the Tate had bought Carl Andre's bricks a few years beforehand, and the public were up in arms about it, or the politicians, and
and the caricaturists.
Yes.
And as many caricaturists focused on house at this time.
Yeah, and this was, there were many, many cartoons made of this, and there was a character, Mr. Gale, who was the guy who lived in the house initially, and who had been a great supporter of it, but until he was sort of, the press, the Sun and the Daily Mirror and the Daily Mail had got onto him and sort of said, well, you don't really like it, do you? You don't really like it at all. And he was then said, if this is art, I'm Leonardo da Vinci, and had sort of changed his mind. But I know that because I knew his daughter, and his daughter sort of said, no, this isn't true, it's just what he's been kind of bullied into doing this. So it was all very, it was a very complicated time, actually. And it was around the time that I won the Turner Prize, and, and I also won this other prize from the KLF for being the worst artist in the country, or some nonsense, which I then spent a long time giving that money away. So it was all very complicated, and I didn't really feel that I absorbed what I'd done and what I'd made until probably a year after I'd done it, because at the time it was just a kind of crazy.
And what does it mean now, do you think, that piece for you? Now that the ground it stood on is a public park and there is only the memory of those of us who are old enough to have seen it.
Yeah, I still feel very proud to have made it. I've often made to go back there for films and things and stand, in the sort of ghost area. Various people have said we should put a plaque there that this had existed, or have something there. But I know that Tower Hamlets would never want to admit to having been the people that wanted it knocked down. So I doubt if that would ever happen. I don't know, I often think maybe I would make something again, something similar, which is sort of what I'm doing with these shy sculptures,
Which
we'll talk about later. But I feel immensely proud to have made it.
Meanwhile, you'd been awarded the DAAD scholarship to have some time in Berlin, where you spent a concentrated period making drawings.
Yeah, I was having a very nice, quiet time in recently undivided Berlin, and it was a very interesting time to be there. The wall had just come down 2 years beforehand, so there were really just the beginnings of the city trying to understand what it was, trying to have the two elements, the West and the East, to be sort of cohesive and to enjoy each other and appreciate each other, which definitely had its problems. There were all sorts of interesting things going on. Architecturally, it was extraordinary, and the wastelands were extraordinary, and the concentration camps were extraordinary. And I became very interested in working in the studio. I had 2 studios. I had a drawing studio in my house, because we'd been living in the tiniest flat in Hoxton, and we moved over to Berlin, and there were 2 bathrooms, 3 bedrooms, 2 living rooms, massive kitchen. You could run from one end of the flat to the other. It was like a dream come true. And one of these rooms I used as a sort of drawing studio. And that really was the time. And I always drew in my studio in Carpenter's Road, but it was very cold, and it always took a long time for the drawings to dry and whatever. And I just loved it and realised that I always needed to have a space, a proper clean space for doing drawings. And it was that time that made that happen.
And these are drawings of parquet flooring. And floors were something you then went on to cast as an expansion of your repertoire?
Yeah, I mean, there's this, Berlin does particularly good wooden floors in these beautiful sort of turn-of-the-century apartments, and in a lot of their older buildings too. And I became very interested in the floors, and as you say, I then cast a lot of floors. And I do work in series, and I always have done, and I often go back to things. So, the floors that I've cast have been cast from all over the place. And the drawings that I've made are sort of based on floors that I've seen all over the place. And a lot of them now are, taken from photographs, something that I've photographed or I have a notion of. A lot of times when I'm on holiday or something, I'll sit and do a drawing of a floor. It's just almost like a doodle.
And drawings are something that you've made and continue to make alongside your sculptural work, and actually as a very separate part of it, but very you, especially with the use of correction fluid as the one on the left here.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the drawing has always been connected to my initial studies as a painter, and enjoying the 2 dimensions of drawing, but also getting frustrated with the 2 dimensions of the paper. And as you can see on the drawing on the right, I'm sort of kind of nudged up to the end and it doesn't feel quite right. And the drawing on the left, I've sort of turned it into a sort of three-dimensional thing. So, you could see from just these two examples that that's something that's always been in my language.
We'll continue to see drawings, as in the exhibition, with this sort of academy hang, which you felt you wanted all the drawings to be mixed up to show it as a part of your practice that just exists all the way through.
Yeah, so one of the drawing on this, that drawing was made before I made Ether, which was back in 1990 or something, and that was done in 2017. So it goes right across that period. And this was something that I made for when I made the plinth in Trafalgar Square. This is from the Whitechapel, the frieze that I made for the Whitechapel. These went alongside a show that I did with the Gagosian Gallery. This was works made after the staircases that I'd done. This was another floor piece. This was for when I made Ghost, actually, very soon after making Ghost, thinking about interconnecting rooms. So they're always, this is a bed piece, which was back in 1991. They're always connected in that way. Always, whenever I make a sculpture, there's 2 or 3 drawings that go with it.
Or even after you've finished
alongside it, or after it finished it, yeah.
And once again, the typology of a hot water bottle seems to be, an object you keep returning to, maybe something for testing new materials.
That's exactly what I've used them for. I mean, they're perfect. I think around the same time I also used rubber gloves, but there's something it's something far too figurative about a rubber glove. You cast a rubber glove and it just looks like this sort of, kind of slightly odd hand. Whereas a hot water bottle, I always feel that they look like sort of headless, limbless torsos, without wanting that to sound too sinister, if that's possible. But they always have a sort of nurtured element to them. So once they're filled with the material, I then place them in such a way that they may be placed on a pillow or something that makes them crease slightly. Or if you look at that one previously, that almost has like a rib cage, or so that they do have this sort of feeling of I can't think of the word. Human, anthropomorphic, that's the word, yeah.
So, resin has figured, in this period, resin figured quite strongly with this resin floor in the foreground and a table and chair to the right. And then in the Devines outside the exhibition, 100 spaces. So the underneath of a chair that you'd cast singly in the past, you began to cast in different configurations, making a sort of greater connection for people with minimalism, the use of seriality, multiple objects. That was probably the first time that you'd started to make groups of works in one.
Yeah, I mean,
work.
the same. There were sort of practical concerns and all of those things. So this was something I found that I could make. I could make it on my own. I could demold it on my own. I could handle it on my own. And I could find out ways of using resin and different types of resin with different types of curing agent, which cause these different colours. So there's, maybe 10 or 15 different types of colour in here. I think there's 8 different types of chair, and they've all been repeated, and they're never shown in exactly the same way. They're just put together, normally in a 10 by 10 grid. This is the first time it's been done in a 5 by 20 grid, which I feel works really well. I'm really pleased with it in that. And it works beautifully in daylight. And when the sort of daylight kisses it, it just changes colour. And it can look like something out of Herculaneum or Pompeii. It can look like a city, or it can look like, something geographical. There are so many different associations that it has. But it can also seem like a sort of very empty place because it's obviously chairs or originated from chairs, but there's no audience, there's no people. And very often, a lot of the things that I make, so in the last slide you showed there was a chair and a table together. There's a piece on the wall that looks like a big white tongue that's cast from a mortuary slab. And, that obviously is an association with one person.
It's very human scale, even
very
this very
scale.
large
Yeah,
work.
exactly, yeah.
The humans are absent, but very much there in the scale. And then resin was something you began to really experiment with in your public projects. And this water tower in New York was an incredible technical endeavour, only surpassed by Monument, the piece that you made for the Trafalgar Square, which is, I think, still the largest piece of cast resin ever made.
Apparently, yeah. To be in the Guinness Book of Records.
So you've continually pushed your materials.
Yes, I have always pushed materials, and much to my horror sometimes, because they don't always go according to plan. The water tower didn't go according to plan, and it sort of... when we were casting it, the interior, the core and the interior broke, and we had to spend, like a month chipping it out, and it was really a pain in the arse. But it was fine once we resolved it. But there are lots of the things that I make have pushed the boundaries with materials. Not so much recently. I mean, with the concrete casting, the smaller buildings that we've been doing, they've been complicated to make, but it's no more difficult than a piece of civil engineering, whereas, say, the monument was really very, very, very difficult thing to make, and the expertise was,
because no one had ever done it before.
No one had ever done it before, yeah.
Then moving through the exhibition to these bookshelves, which relate very closely to another public project, the Holocaust Memorial in Vienna, where you again return to concrete. And the longest, most drawn-out public project you worked on, 5 years, from the time you were awarded it to the time you actually completed it. But in the process, incredibly rich theme of work developed. A lot of works based on the bookcases or the book that was the main feature of this library.
And tables, there were lots of tables.
And these tables that resulted from your endless bureaucratic meetings to discuss the subject. I know it's a sore subject, but would you like to touch on that
I'm actually
period?
going back to Vienna in a couple of weeks, and it's the first time since it was installed that I will have been there. So I'm looking forward to it. I understand the piece looks very well still. It has held up well, and people in the city use it, love it, appreciate it, and it's really doing a good job. So I'm very happy about that. I was a very young artist when I was asked to put in a proposal for this, and I almost naively went into it, thought about what I'd like to do, went along to what's called a jury, which when you're doing architectural competitions, that's what they call it, a jury, and you have to go and stand in front of a group of people. It's an absolutely terrifying experience. And I went to this thing, and they sort of said, "It looks like a bunker. Why are you making something that looks like a bunker?" And I'd say, "Really? Does it really? I don't think it looks like a bunker." And I was trying to be very sort of sweet, knowing full well that it looked like a bunker, and wanting it to be this very aggressive but sort of poetic object. But I wanted to I needed to kind of get it in under the carpet, as it were. And eventually I didn't know, I thought this had gone absolutely terribly. I went out that night with a couple of the other people. We got completely pissed. I went in the morning to the airport and really hungover, feeling absolutely dreadful. And I got on the aeroplane, and they then took me off the aeroplane. And the air hostess says, really exciting news. You've won this competition that you were in. And I was like, oh, God, no. And I went back to the city of Vienna and was then in this situation, you know, a very sombre and complex thing to get involved with in Vienna. You know, bearing in mind that I don't know if they do now, but they weren't even teaching the Holocaust in schools. You know, it was something that was really put under the carpet there. They didn't really want to know. And Simon Wiesenthal, who was a Jewish hunter, the Nazi hunter who was Jewish, was very much a part of this whole process. And he was very excited because he'd realised that I was Jewish, which in fact I'm not. But he understood, because my name was Rachel, that I was a good young Jewess and that this would be great that I was doing this project. And he had his arm around me and was really proud of his young Jewess. And the TV crews and, you know, newspapers were there. And they were all shouting at me, Rachel, are you Jewish? And I had to say no, obviously. And his arm sunk from my side. And he didn't speak to me for the next 5 years, which was then how long it took to make the piece. So it was very difficult. And there were 4 changes in government whilst I was trying to make it. There was a lot of opposition from essentially Nazis there. It was difficult. But anyway, it's done and it's there.
And the good news is that you're going there to talk to the Einundzwanziger House, which is part of the Belvedere, where this show is actually going in spring next year, which for an audience with that Holocaust memorial, I think is a really important thing to be able to see the range of your work.
Yes. No, and I'm genuinely excited about it, and it'll be good.
So working through the exhibition, the staircase, which is actually part of Tate's collection, and just beyond the 9 tables is a metal floor, were both cast from the synagogue that before you actually moved in to make it your home and your studio with Marcus and the children. Memory, the imprint of memory, the importance of location, it's another question that's come up a lot.
Yeah, so we found this old building and in the East End of London on the corner of Bethnal Green Road, and it was one of those invisible buildings in London which had been left unused for about 10 years. It had been a synagogue up until the 70s. Before that, it had been a Baptist church, I think, at one point. And then it was a textiles factory, and it had these various different lives. And when we saw it, it was very sort of derelict and unkempt. We decided that we were going to live there and work there. And it was in the time when the East End was really shitty, and we had prostitutes on the doorstep, and but it was great. It was a great place to be, a great place to live. And in order to really understand the building and to try and sort of feel it, I suppose, I decided that I wanted to cast a lot of it. And so I cast various areas of the floor where the Torah would have been read from, another area in the ladies' gallery. I cast 3 staircases in the building, which were, when I made House, the one thing that really frustrated me about it was the way in which I treated the staircase when I was casting it. So this was a time to really be able to look at that. So I cast these 3 staircases. I also cast 2 apartments. I mean, it was a bit unhinged, the amount of stuff I did cast, but they all have homes. The Tate owns the apartment as well as the staircase. The Guggenheim own another staircase and the other apartment. And
what do you think the resonance is of that, the history of that building?
Well, I think it was one of those extraordinary buildings in the East End that sort of grew from nothing, and it obviously been made by you don't have parishioners, do you, in a synagogue? But the people, the congregation,
Public subscription.
or whatever, the congregation had been part of building it, and there'd obviously been there was a lot of concrete involved, and when we had to demolish part of it, it was really difficult to do that. But for me, it was about tracing the sort of history of the building, and we went to a lot of trouble. That there were these weird, very uninteresting stained glass windows that we felt we had to ask about, and so we got a rabbi to come in. There were lots of books in the basement, and we got the rabbi to look at the books and look at the things, and we were very respectful about how to deal with materials that had been left there.
Yeah.
But basically a synagogue can be made in a chip shop. It doesn't really matter where a synagogue is. So in the end they just said doesn't matter. But the council, of course, because we'd sort of made it public to drawn attention to it, we then had to spend vast amounts of money dealing with the stained glass windows. Preserving it, yeah.
And again, drawings, this actually followed making the sculpture, and then 10 years before you ever made a staircase,
so this is exactly the kind of thing that shows you how, my brain works, that this was drawings that I would have made around the time of making House, and it was the fact that I couldn't actually kind of get to the staircase and do the staircase in the same way, so I drew it all out and just played with the idea of it.
And then Room 101, which is the large room cast in the exhibition, which was commissioned by Modus Operandi when the BBC was being demolished. Now, it is said that George Orwell used this as a model for Room 101 in 1984. We don't know for sure. So that could be a fictional memory. How does that relate?
Well, it's a great story. George Orwell worked at the BBC. He hated working at the BBC. He felt like a spy, I think, working there. And he had this room that was his office, and, he was very unhappy there. So they came to me with this idea that I would do something with this room. When I went into the room, it was full of plant, it was full of sort of metal boxes and aluminium casing and whatever. And I just said, right, rip all of that stuff out, take it out as roughly as you can, and they just pulled all this stuff out. I then just cleaned it up a bit and cast it. And it feels like a room that's been under siege. It feels like a room that's been in a war zone. And it has a kind of blankness to it.
And it no longer exists.
It no longer exists. It was demolished. So it's a sort of memory, an encapsulated memory. Sorry, I can't remember what your question was.
Does it matter to you that it's potentially a fictional rather than a real memory?
No, not at all. And actually, with these shy sculptures, that's definitely something that I'm dealing with as well now. And even inventing things and, making things up myself. So
yeah. So making our way through the exhibition again, in a way, a public piece that was about a memory that was very personal, both this large-scale work and works that you'd been making in the lead up to it. Could you just touch on those groups of work?
I had been... the Tate had asked me to do something in the Turbine Hall, and, it's a great commission to be given, but it's also very daunting. It's a massive place, and in order to try and make something, I wanted to try and fill it in some way. And my mother had died about a year before, and my sisters and I, she died very suddenly, and we were quite in a state of sort of shock, I suppose, and mourning and grief. And we weren't really able to deal with sorting her house out. And it wasn't, I suppose it was about 7 months after she died that we started to sort out her house and box things up and throw things away. And I found this box in her basement which was an old sellotape box, and it was about that big, and it had the old blue sellotape sign on it, and it had Christmas decorations written on it, and I just took this box and flattened it, and my sister was about to throw it away, and I said, no, don't throw it away, I want to keep it. And I just had it in my studio, and I was just looking at it. It was just, I pinned it to the wall and just felt sort of quite drawn to it and nostalgic about it. And that was really the starting point for making this piece. So this is casts of, I think it was 20 different types of boxes that were cast in polypropylene, which was a material which could be shredded afterwards, and it was a very sort of eco piece, shredded and all turned back into street furniture afterwards. And other than casting the boxes, I happened to go to the Arctic at the same time, and wanted to go and see sort of whiteness and ice, and so looked at that, and then came back and created this. But during that time, I'd also been working in the studio on these boxes made in plaster, which were much more sensitive in their materiality and their texture, and also used some colour, which you can see in that.
Yeah, and then you moved into colour in a big way in these series of smaller sculptures. And I think you've said that after the vastness of the turbine hall, it was a relief to go back into the studio and make small work on your own. But a lot of the questions about these have been about colour and your relationship with colour.
Yeah, I mean, during this period, I had 2 very small children, and there was a certain playfulness as well about the piece in the turbine hall. And I'd loved playing with the kids, making Lego and building things and whatever. And I sort of used that as a kind of inspiration, and the kind of colour and Play-Doh and, poster paints and things that we were using at home. And I used all of those things, and I just sort of brought it down to the studio and just started playing again. And I loved it, and I had no assistance, and this piece is made from toilet rolls. There are some little resin pieces there, but they're mainly plaster with pigment in them. I think the next piece is... that's also resin plaster and pink plaster. And I made a whole group of these things. It was a period of about 18 months, 2 years of work. All very small things. And what I would do was I'd make a whole bunch of elements and have tables of them and have these little shelves, and then just go in and compose little sort of sculptural vignettes and see if I like them. Go down later with a glass of wine, go there the next day, leave it for a couple of days, then change them around, throw some away, and when they felt right, I'd take a photograph and put a sticker on them and go, right, finished.
And you wrote something that's in the catalogue that was originally for the Whitechapel Reader on Colour about how your relationship with colour changed quite early on as a child, to living in rooms that were always white, and yet colour keeps coming into your work, and you ask yourself whether it's to do with the materials, whether it's to do with emotions. But from those early urine-coloured resin pieces through these very bright Lego-esque colours, the resin that you have been using more recently is a sort of different palette again.
It's a sort of muted palette, yeah. I think the more recent colour has come much more through looking at the naturalistic landscape, through looking out of windows, looking out of doors, about architecture, about lights, about different times of the day, about weather. So all of those things which, as an artist, I think you make a vocabulary and you decide things and you give yourself certain rules to play with. And then, if you're brave enough to let yourself change those rules, then really you can do anything. And, I think many artists, it took me a long time to realise that, actually.
Yeah.
And, when we were installing this show, installing this wall of windows and doors was actually the hardest bit to do. And because everything else, there were sort of white blocks, and then you put a bit of colour and you could kind of think about it, and it was like composing a sort of symphony or something. And then you came to this area and there were all these sort of flat things that needed to be somehow resonate.
And in this installation, you mixed up plaster doors with resin doors and windows made sometimes 8-10 years later, and yet that's still a type, as expansive as it is, because you use like domestic doors, barn doors, palazzo doors, but it's still a type that you find a rich seam.
Yeah, and I still do, and I wherever I go in the world, I take photographs of doors. Doors are everywhere, and they all have different sort of architectural elements to them, different proportions, different reasons for being doors. There's one door in there, I think it's from the 17th century, and I'm not sure if you've got a picture of it, but it's further around. And that's, they're kind of amazing, really, these things that have been in the same house, and the house has sort of changed shape, but the doors always remained the same, and it's just the in-out of life, I think.
So before we finish off and open the floor up to questions, there's just a few more things I'd like you to cover. Obviously, your shy sculptures that are appearing, in landscapes that are quite difficult to get to, so that you actually just come across them either as here on Governor's Island, an island not often visited in New York, shed outside, the chicken shed outside our lawn, but there are sheds also in Norfolk, in Norway, in the California desert.
Yeah, it's been a group of work that I've really loved working on, and it's been very much for myself and my own enjoyment and fulfillment. And I think I remember having this idea, must have been about 8 years ago, where I just thought, I just want to start making things that they don't have to be in a place, no one has to see them. It's just about them being and existing, and photographs can exist, and maybe I'll make a map one day and a book, and people can go on a kind of trail to try and find them all. And I was asked to make a piece in Norway. We cast this boat shed, which lives on the fjord, which gets frozen in the winter and covered in snow, and then it's just in the water in the summer. This piece that's on Governor's Island, which is called Cabin.
So they're huts, sheds,
they're
cabins,
huts, sheds, they're sometimes
shelters.
sort of peripatetic buildings, which something like a chicken shed, which could be moved around a landscape, or there's a sort of shepherd's hut that I cast that's in Norfolk. There are these 2 cabins in the desert in California, which are called shotgun cabins or shotgun shacks. And they've both been cast, and they're sort of in the middle of nowhere on private land, but a guy who looks after them loves taking people there. It becomes a sort of real journey and a joy. I've always loved the lightning field in the desert. Which desert is it? David? Mexico.
New Mexico.
New Mexico. There's a lightning field where you can go and you stay in a sort of cowboy's hut there. And, I love this idea of the journey, or going to the Spiral Jetty, the Smithson Spiral Jetty, which, doesn't really exist anymore. But it's about the journey of going there and about seeing a place that kind of exists in your mind's eye but doesn't really. And, so I was using those as kind of examples. So again, looking back at the minimalists' sort of language and sort of playing with it. So I've now made 4 or 5 or 6 of these. I'm probably making one in Yorkshire next year. So maybe one in France. It's an ongoing, lifelong project.
So public sculptures are very much part of your repertoire.
And they're called shy sculptures. The group of them are called shy sculptures.
And they're directly related to frieze-type works that you've begun making relatively recently, with a material that you first used to make your very first sculptures.
Yeah, so when I was at Brighton, the very first sculptures that I ever made were in papier-mâché, and I've started using it again as a material. And something that I've developed after moving house and studio a couple of years ago. And it all happened very quickly. We sold our building very quickly and we had to get out. And I couldn't work out what I wanted to throw away, what I didn't want to throw away, so I bought a lot of crap with me. And then gradually has gone through, sorted through everything, and then been shredding it all, and then making papier-mâché with it. So these are taken from a building, and they're papier-mâché. And there's lots of little words on them and bits of tomato or cat food. Or one of them was cast from all the excess materials I had from making a couple of books about house. So it's a bit like the sort of Proustian looking back through my life and using materials in that way.
And how do they relate to the frieze that you're making for the American Embassy?
Yeah, so the new American Embassy, which is happening or opening, should have opened last year, should have opened when Obama was in office. Unfortunately, it didn't. So I'm now doing it whilst Trump's in office, which is not something I relish. Hopefully he won't come over to open it. So I've made this essentially it's a flat pack building which is cast in concrete, which stretches across a wall probably a bit longer than the length of this gallery. And it's the entire building, but cast in a similar way to this. And it's on the public entrance to the embassy. And it's based on the sort of 1950s flat pack houses, which a lot of America is built on, for the sort of people that moved there in the 50s.
Again, housing, shelter, the material that surrounds us. So lastly, Rachel, after you come out of your amazing show, back into the Veen Galleries again, you have kindly made a selection of other artists' work for Tate, selected from the collection. Some your peers, some influencers, some younger artists. You had no difficulty whatsoever in selecting a strong group of female artists for this display. But I think perhaps the last question we'd like to ask is, as a female artist who's been working through 30 years, how does it look for the future? Is it going to continue to be a struggle to get equal billing with men?
Well, I hope not. I think that, as this show, hopefully my show shows that, women artists are out there and doing a good job. There are lots of us about. My mother was an artist, so, her generation, I would say, worked incredibly hard to make it possible for my generation to be able to sort of work, not seamlessly, but work alongside men as our peers and contemporaries. There's still, not that I care about this stuff, but it's worth mentioning, there's still a lot of, I think within the sort of financial aspect of making art, there's a big discrepancy in the prices that women get for their work and men get for their work. But I'm incredibly proud and that I'm able to make a living from my work and live a great life doing what I do.
I think one of the most the most inspiring things is to see an artist of our generation having a huge show and it being really appreciated by a broad number of people. It's an inspiration to younger artists, especially to women artists.
I think one of the loveliest things someone said to me actually was a friend of mine had brought a young artist to the opening and she was 24 or something, 25, and she just said, "I'm going to go home now and work." She said, I'm so excited to see 30 years of someone's work, and that's a great thing. And I hear that a lot of students come here. There's been lots of school trips here, You know, and it's great to be able to help educate people. Actually.
Yeah. On that note, we should open it up to the floor, because I'm sure there'll be lots more questions beyond what I've articulated. Do we have the microphones ready? Fantastic. So who's got a burning question that they'd like to ask Rachel? Or anything in general about the exhibition?
I think there's...
I'd like to ask more about the doors, whether there's a symbol with the doors of going through different dimensions because of the fact that they are see-through.
Well, there hadn't been, but there might be now. No.
Okay, thanks.
I don't think about other dimensions, really, apart from 3 dimensions.
I think there was someone a few rows ahead.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Don't worry about the microphone.
That's right. I think I can fill the room. Because of my background, I was first drawn to your work and read about you in the papers because of the Holocaust Memorial in Vienna. I hadn't realised that you'd lived in Berlin. Technology is, but there's a very different emphasis between the Berlin Holocaust Memorial ethnic cleansing of unknown people who are known. Own about all the ideas was, very, very moving because it's lives, the lives, very different emphasis. And I just wondered whether there was any atmosphere in the 2 cities and the differences.
Well, I think they're very different. You know, they're 2 very different cities. Berlin was a city that did nothing but apologise for what had happened and felt deeply conscious of all the atrocities, whereas Vienna was completely the opposite, pretended that it hadn't happened virtually. So I think if I'd been asked to do a memorial in Berlin, it would have probably been a different memorial. I don't know. But, you know, the memorial, you're talking about the Eisenhower. No, who's the architect? I've forgotten who.
I can't remember.
Liebsky. No, it's Daniel Liebsky made a building, but there's a memorial. Eisenman, yeah.
And the memorial is essentially
yes, of blocks, yeah.
blocks that look like a graveyard, but with no.
Yeah. I think one of the issues with that memorial, I don't know what I think about this per se, but is that people sit on the blocks all the time and children jump on and run on them. And I personally think that's okay, but a lot of people don't think that's okay. You know, I think if a memorial like that has, you know, I think people have very different relationships with memorials. I did a lot of looking at memorials around the world, looking in Washington at the Mile Memorial, going and looking at various Holocaust museums and seeing how they'd sort of dealt with it. One of the most extraordinary memorials, I think, ever produced is something that Steven Spielberg made, which is an auditory memorial, which is a series of monologues by people that just, you know, so you go into a sort of cinematic experience and just listen to these people. You know, I think memorials can be all sorts of different things for different places, and, you know, I couldn't really comment on whether or not I thought that was good or bad.
You have recently been asked if people can sit on the plinth of your memorial because it was happening anyway, and you felt that was completely okay.
Yes, yeah, it's not something that worries me, yeah.
And I was just wondering whether you had thought of casting forms of transport, for instance, like cars or planes for large scale.
No. No, it's not something that I'm
Not drawn to.
not drawn to, no.
Could you tell us something about there's a picture, but you didn't speak to it. It looks like a doll's house. I don't think it's
Oh, yeah.
cast too. I'm not sure.
It was actually cast from a doll's house, yeah. It's on the it's back. Yeah, it was cast from a doll's house. Someone actually gave me this doll's house. I've never really I never normally respond to gifts to say, hey, can you cast this? But actually, it was a particularly good doll's house. And I'd been collecting doll's houses, and there's a permanent piece now at the Museum of Childhood, which I donated to them. This was, it's a doll's house. So you need to go and see it, because actually you sort of look through the gaps, you can see staircases and doors, and there's all sorts of interesting sort of interior things going on, which that doesn't really give credit to what it looks like. So
The casting of the staircase feels almost like a piece of bravado, in the sense that it feels technically complex. Is that sort of, we'll let them work that out as to how I managed to cast a staircase?
No, not at all. No, not at all. I mean, they are like Chinese puzzles. I mean, actually making them is like making a Chinese puzzle, and you're inside something, and you're thinking, how are we going to get this out? And but we did. I've got a great technician that I work with who, we used to go to the pub and we'd work it out on the backs of beer mats and things. It's just, and then you understand the language, and over the years we've managed to work out how to do these things.
And as you can see from the image, they're all blocks that fix together, just as with the large-scale works. Just about man or woman size.
Does the casting process always end up with the destruction of the thing that contained the space?
No, the staircases didn't, and the building didn't. So no, not always.
But smaller things?
Often, yeah. I mean, I sometimes make moulds, but often they just, toilet rolls.
I find that the type of materials that you use are quite industrial, and you cast inanimate objects, but I find that your works have so much poetry and almost capturing human experiences, as if it's like a fossil of a human experience. Is that something that has ever... do you have anything to comment about that?
No, other than that's a very nice way of putting it, and something that I do try and do. When I made Ghost, I said that I was trying to mummify the air in a room. So it's a sort of similar thing, trying to fossilise the air.
And something that you have a collection of in your studio are a bunch of fossils and ammonites.
Yes, yeah.
Recording life in the materials.
Do you ever feel the need to do preparatory drawings for any of your sculptures, or do you tend to do them after you've made them?
I do preparatory drawings. They're kind of sketches more than anything, and now sometimes we use sort of computer drawings and stuff. It's not using computers. Not something that it's not my natural sketch pad. A little A4 sketchbook is something that I'd rather use. But we do have to use them sometimes, and especially for, having to do CAD drawing. If you're doing something for the American Embassy, for example, everything has to be looked at by engineers, and in which case you have to do specialist drawings in order to get them sort of stamped and signed off for health and safety.
Can I just ask? I really love your piece house. And I live on an estate in Lambeth that is going to be, in inverted commas, regenerated and potentially demolished. So I find it a particularly moving piece of work. And I wondered whether you had any thoughts on, or how you feel about the way London has changed over the last 20 years, and any opinions about social cleansing.
Well,
No pressure.
I love London. I love the fact that London is a big world soup. I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather live. I think that the gentrification of London has been going on for far longer than 20 years. It's been going on. I'm 54. Am I 54? 50. Yes. I am 54, yeah. And it's been going on as long as I can remember. I loved Shoreditch. I used to live there. I lived there for 30 years. I loved it. I can't stand the place now. I mean, I love parts of it, but, there are areas that it's just become kind of ridiculous. It's become a caricature of a city, a caricature of a place. I think that places need to grow naturally. If you start throwing money at something, it doesn't grow naturally. We experienced this when we lived in Berlin, that 10 years later, after having lived there, there was no heart to the city anymore, because it had sort of two hearts, and then they got rid of those two hearts and then tried to make a heart in the centre, but there wasn't one. So I think urban planning has a lot to answer for, but also just the way in which people live together and how different communities live together has a lot to answer for. And I think it's very hard often for councils to get that right, especially people that have very little money. It's a very big, difficult problem, but often people, you can see London has generated in such a way that obviously it works, and there are great communities of people rubbing alongside each other, and hopefully that will always continue. So no to social cleansing, I say, I think.
In your vitrine, you have a small piece, which is of lots of small furniture and refrigerators and stuff. Could you speak a bit about that?
They were things that I found when I was making these doll's house works, and often the doll's houses would come with little bits of furniture in them, and they were just things that I liked because they were miniature versions of the furniture that I was using to make other sculptures with.
But you made a sort of a limited edition of that? Is that right?
Oh yes, I did, yeah. That was from some people who counter editions, and that was as if I wanted to make something that was like a pile that you'd find outside a second-hand shop.
Hello. Over here.
Oh, hi.
Bit of a nerdy engineering question for you, sorry. On a lot of your pieces the earlier ones, the larger scale ones, there's no pitched roofs, but on the later ones, your Shire sculptures, there's pitched roofs, which are notoriously difficult to do in concrete normally. Did you have to go in through the roof to do that, or?
The small ones, no, they're cast from inside.
So did you have to come out through the roof then? Is that? Or is this one of the tricks of the trade?
I'm not going to tell you. Secret. I'll have all the engineers wanting to know.
Any more questions?
We've got one last question here.
Hello, hi. I just wanted to ask about House. I love it as a sculpture, and it's really sad that it doesn't exist anymore, other than in pictures and as a record. Is there any plan to regenerate that as an idea and reform?
Not at the moment. Maybe it's something that I would do again if the right opportunity came up, but not at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we're looking forward to the future, so thank you very much to Rachel and to Anne and to all of you for your questions and coming tonight. So we'll draw it to a close. Thank you very much.